So, let's go back to introducing Tim. Sorry for the break there, commercial break. It's a pleasure to introduce Tim O'Connor. He's the Professor of Philosophy at Indiana University. He's been a research fellow at the University of Notre Dame and the University of St Andrews, and is currently a visiting fellow at Oriel College, Oxford. He's got interest in metaphysics, philosophy of the mind, and philosophy of religion. He's written a number of books, one of which is on the bookstall, which is Theism and Ultimate Explanation, so you can get that downstairs later. He has been interested in philosophical questions concerning human free will, and more recently on emerging sciences of brain and behaviour, and the question of whether and how they pose challenges to all the notions of freedom and moral responsibility. So I think this is what he's talking about now, so I'll hand over to Tim. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. What I want to discuss today is some interesting recent scientific work concerning the sources, the underlying causes and sources of human action. This ongoing work is getting a lot of play in the popular press, delivered in the form of an interpretation of it that is favored by many of the scientific players themselves. And to be blunt about it, this interpretive stance tries to get rid of me. Well, not just me, me, you, everybody. I may be paranoid, but I'm not completely narcissistic. It's all of us. All right, I should acknowledge up front that defenders of this interpretation don't generally put it quite that bluntly, but that's how their view looks to me. Because according to these influential social psychologists and neuroscientists, I'm never in control of what I am doing. They don't just say that sometimes I have the illusion of being in control of what I'm doing, and I'm mistaken. They want to hold a quite general thesis that I'm never in control of what I'm doing. I, they say, am trapped in a body without direct access to the controls which lie buried deep within the subpersonal machinery of my brain. Mental states may play an unconscious role, they allow, in causing what I do, but I don't consciously direct my actions. I don't really decide anything. All right, so here are 3 books in this genre. There are many others I could have put up. These are all fairly recent. Michael Gazzaniga is a very prominent neuroscientist. He recently wrote a book, Who's in Charge? Free Will and the Science of the Brain. The answer is, you're not in charge. Daniel Wegner was a very prominent social psychologist at Harvard. He just died a year ago. Wrote a book, The Illusion of Conscious Will, which surveys a lot of the sort of work that, at least some of the older work in the genre that I'm going to be talking about today. I do recommend that book. It's very entertaining. He writes very well, and it's a nice introduction to some of this literature, even if, as I think, his conclusions are all wrong. And then there's Sam Harris, who's a busy author. He doesn't quite have any particular reason to be a popular author, but somehow he is. He's written on religious belief. He wrote a book called Letter to a Christian Nation in the US, I think in the year 2002. It's become rather popular. He cranks out a lot of books. I think he's subsequently recently got a PhD in neuroscience, I believe. And you can see that from the 2 books over here, this kind of puppet on a strings theme is a common motif. They're not the only ones to have this on the cover of their books. All right, to their credit, these thinkers offer evidence for this rather astounding claim that none of us is really in control of what we do. To their demerit, this evidence is not very impressive. All right, that's what I'm going to try to persuade you. But my purpose is not a wholly negative one. I want to go on to suggest that science does have the potential to teach us more nuanced lessons concerning the scope and limits of human freedom of action and in consequence, moral responsibility. These folks are trying to draw a very strong conclusion. I'm wanting to say that conclusion is completely unwarranted by the evidence that they offer. But it does indicate that science is beginning to get under the hood of human motivation, human psychology, showing us some things that I think are largely in line with what we would have antecedently thought, and I'll suggest that later. But they're showing us some surprising details, and so science does have things to teach us, I think. It's just that we have to be very cautious about the lessons that we draw. Okay, so the naysayers, these folks and others, maintain that our experiences, we do have experiences as of directly, consciously controlling some of our own choices and actions, right? It feels like I'm in control, I'm deciding what to do. But they maintain these experiences are quite generally illusory. They do not correspond, these subjective experiences as of control, do not correspond to any genuine exercise of control over a choice or action. It's not what's actually initiating behavior, any kind of conscious experience of willing or deciding something. So Patrick Haggard, a prominent neuroscientist in London, found in London. You can see this is from the Telegraph. What is it about the Telegraph? Right, the second one to have one of these covers. There's a picture of Patrick. He's what you can see the title of the article. This is 2011, so fairly recent. Neuroscience, Free Will, and Determinism. I'm just a machine. That's the message he's wanting to deliver. I'm not the only philosopher to have had an opportunity to try to persuade him that while he does very interesting scientific work, the philosophical conclusion he draws is totally unwarranted. He's incorrigible on this point. I'm sorry, I'm sad to say. But he does very good, very interesting studies, and I'll tell you about some of them in a moment. On the other hand, there's kind of an unstable view, because then you see this thing from Science Daily, which is a respectable source for kind of new recent results coming out. Do fruit flies have free will? You can probably guess where this article is going, right? And the idea is, well, fruit flies, it turns out, if you try to model kind of how they buzz around, right, it's random, right? There's randomness equals free will, so fruit flies have free will, okay? It really is that embarrassing of an article, but I thought I would throw that out there for fun. And finally, there's a picture of Dan Wegner, the person I told you wrote The Illusion of Conscious Will, and you can see, I'm giving the name willusionism. That is, the will is an illusion to this view that these people have. You can see he's got a little flow chart that captures what he thinks is going on in abstract terms when humans act. We have unconscious causes of action, and these cause, through some purely unconscious route, the initiation of action. But they also give rise to thought, some kind of unconscious thought, that causes conscious thoughts, including the experience of will. And then we mistakenly, because these kinds of these experiences of being in control regularly correlate with behavior, we mistakenly think that the one causes the other. That's his kind of rough picture. And the more careful proponents of this doctrine do allow that these experiences as of control pretty reliably correlate with, and as Wegner suggests, are likely caused by wholly unconscious causal processes that are the real sources of our behavior. All right, why do the willusionists make such an extraordinary and sweeping claim? Well, they give a cumulative case argument. Right? They assemble evidence from many different spheres, right? And they want to suggest this evidence all points in the same direction, and taken cumulatively, it constitutes a very powerful argument for this willusionist picture. I'm going to indicate 6 different kinds of studies. These are the main ones one hears about. They're talked about extensively by Wegner in his book, and others bring these up regularly. And I'll save the best for last, right? The one that people find the most persuasive, that will come up at the end. So here they are. Number 1. So neurosurgeons, turns out, operating on the brains of conscious patients. Yeah, apparently when you have neurosurgery done, or at least it's possible, you don't have to be unconscious. You might think that's excruciatingly painful, but no, you just need a local anesthetic on your scalp. That would be painful if they cut into that without anesthetic on the scalp, but the brain tissue itself doesn't have pain receptors on the surface, so that is not painful. And because we only know so much about the brain, we've learned quite a bit in the last 3-4 decades, but especially when some of these experiments were done back in the late 60s. They knew precious little, so you want the person to be awake, so if you do something that you probably shouldn't have done, something about their reaction will tip you off that maybe you don't want to be poking in just that area. So anyways, the neurosurgeons operating on the brains of conscious patients have been able to directly induce behaviors, such as the raising of a hand, by electrically stimulating the motor cortex areas of the brain. We have very good reason to believe that the patients did not form a conscious choice to move their arm when this happened, right? The motor cortex, we're told, is downstream of any brain area that is plausibly associated with conscious decision. So it's just a direct stimulation causing the nerve fibers, the arm sense of command, the arm goes up. There was no, experience of willing. However, when asked by the surgeon immediately after they moved their arms, the patients tended to confabulate rational explanations, and to do so apparently completely sincerely, right? Saying things like, oh, I was trying to get your attention. I was feeling uncomfortable, or something like that, right? That's what they tended to do. It's kind of spooky, isn't it? Right? Because they apparently believed that's what was going on. They persuaded themselves like that. I was trying to get this person's attention. That's why I moved my arm, right? That's not what happened. They didn't move. There was no conscious control. It was directly, their arm was caused to move by the action of the neurosurgeon. But what exactly is going, so it is kind of unsettling, right? But what exactly is going on here? Nothing, I think it needs to be seen right away, nothing is going on that involves the illusory or not experience of conscious willing. But instead, right, by hypothesis, right, the way that the experiment is set up or the situation is set up, there is no experience of willing. There's just the movement of the arm. And then there's an after-the-fact belief, right, about there having been an experience or there having been a choice to move the arm. Now, and that's kind of surprising because we don't think that usually is going on. We make up false beliefs about what we just did, right? But given our prior expectations and assumptions, it's not plausible, such as our arms usually only goes up when we decide to raise it, unless somebody else is, visibly lifting it, right? We tend, apparently, to unconsciously interpret what we see, the movement of the arm, and we interpret it in line with our normal expectations, without being aware that this is what we're doing. And in fact, this fits in with a lot of other evidence that suggests prior expectations can powerfully shape how we interpret experiences, our own conscious experiences and things that are happening. Our memories, so a take-home lesson here is that our memories, even our memories about what just happened in us, are fallible. Sometimes we can engage in unconscious rewriting, right, of what actually just happened. This is good to know, right? Our memories are not perfect. But what has this to do with the willusionist thesis, which is a thesis about the illusory character of the experience of willing? Nothing at all, as far as I can see, because this is not an episode involving such an experience. Well, you might think there's more to say about that, but I'm going to move on. Okay, second, people are susceptible in a variety of contexts to the inducement of false beliefs regarding their own agency. So, studies have shown that if we prompt subjects, so we take somebody like Lydia, we tell Lydia, it might take some work to try to get Lydia to do this, but you give Lydia a voodoo doll, right? This is, she's feeling very squeamish about participating in this experiment, but it's a voodoo doll made out to look like Rodney. And you tell Lydia, and you say, look, I'm going to pay you 10 pounds, and she says, okay. All right, and so what I want you to do is start jabbing that doll with this pin and think nasty thoughts about Rodney. Ill-wishing kind of thoughts, right? Wanting him to feel pain. Then what you do is you have Rodney come in, he's kind of a confederate of the experiment, And he comes in and he's like, oh, just all of a sudden, oh, I got this horrible headache. It just came on out of nowhere. Oh, it's just, oh, sorry, I'm gonna have to go home. This is just terrible. I've got to go lie down. Lydia, unsurprisingly, is going to have a disposition. Her inclination to think she had something to do with that goes up. Okay? Other examples of things like this are if you watch via a television screen, your favorite sporting team, right? Your football team, you cheer them on and they win the game, right? People have a certain tendency. Psychologists, of course, ask them, on a scale of 1 to 5 or whatever, how much do you think you have some influence? And there's some uptick in people's belief, if the outcome corresponds with what they were rooting for, to think, yeah, kind of a 2, 3, I had a little something to do with that. You do it at home because you might think if they were in the stadium, well, it was me together with all the fans cheering them on, you might think we actually did have some causal influence on the game. But, at home, people. So what does this tell us? Well, as I see it, these kinds of simple studies in social psychology are just adding one more plank to the overwhelming case that most people are suckers. Did you say that here? Specifically, they show that belief concerning the wider consequences of our choices and actions can be manipulated. It's highly entertaining, right? When we see this about ourselves. But think about what's going on. Lydia did, in the experiment, jab the doll. That was her action. And nothing about the experiment leads us to doubt that she was efficaciously willing to do that, deciding to do that. The person sitting at home on the sofa really was cheering on the team. That's what they did. And let's say they were in control of what they were doing. Perhaps not. Depends on the details of that case. That's clear, right? But what is happening is these people are coming to have further beliefs about the wider causal consequences out in the environment of their actions, right? And people are susceptible to thinking they have more influence than they actually have. Right? That's nothing about our direct conscious control over our choices or even our own actions, right? It's just it's the malleability of our beliefs about how much influence we're having out there in the world. So when used to, I think this has nothing to do with the efficacy of our conscious will. So again, it's an interesting study, but it just seems to miss the target. Both these first two examples do not target the experience of willing, which is what needs to be the target if you're going to support some kind of illusionism, not after the fact beliefs either about what one has done or what one has indirectly brought about. All right, the next two examples have more relevance, but they also do not squarely aim at the illusionist target. Okay. Subjects, so here in this little experiment, that's a magnet, a handheld magnet. Your left or right index finger. They say, you choose, but do it spontaneously. Make a free choice, okay? But wait until you get a signal. Maybe a light goes on, okay? Once you see the light, make a spontaneous choice. While they're waiting for the signal, a magnet is secretly moved across the motor area of either the left or the right side of their brain. Okay, there's a certain area, there's known to be a certain area of the brain that controls motor behavior, like the movement of your arm, and the left side of the brain, the motor area on the left side of your brain controls the movement of your right hand, and vice versa. Okay? And the subjects don't know that a magnet is being waved. I don't know how this gets by the human review board. I don't know if there's any worry about having long-term, I don't know. Presumably it's thought to be safe, okay? And what happens is subjects show a modestly increased tendency to move the finger that's contralateral to the opposite side that was stimulated, while believing that they were choosing voluntarily and without having any sense of discernible external impulse. Okay? Interesting, right? So I think it's true that if you don't do anything funny with magnets and you ask people to move them left or right, and then you study the distribution of behaviors, people will roughly 60% of the time move the finger of their dominant hand. So right-handed people about 60% of the time will opt for their right hand. Left-handed people roughly 60% of the time will opt for the left. And what happens under the influence of this magnet is those numbers get roughly reversed. So people go against their dominant hand by a slight. So it's a measurable, statistically significant difference, but a modest difference. It's not as if 100% of the time you move a magnet and this kind of controls. It's just an increased tendency to go in the direction controlled by the area of the brain that's magnetically stimulated. So what to say about this? Well, first thing to say, of course, is that our motives, this is not talking about motives here, right? But our motives, I think we all recognize, are not fully known to us. Jane Austen, Dostoevsky, and other great novelists teach us that, right? For that matter, so does the Bible and other forms of ancient wisdom literature, right? That we don't always know exactly why we're doing what we're doing. Sometimes we're a mystery to ourselves, right? What's different here is evidence that the factors that influence our choices can include what you might call brutally physical, non-rational influences, right? The magnetic stimulation doesn't suddenly give you a reason for favoring one hand or the other. It doesn't operate that way. It doesn't somehow induce a conscious thought. Oh, it would be better to move my right hand because blah, blah, blah. Nothing like that goes on. It just exerts a kind of physical influence over so it gives you a greater likelihood to do something, and it's a purely physical influence. It doesn't operate by a rational deliberation. This is a bit surprising, and it drives home the lesson that we are not disembodied pure wills, totally rational and transparent to ourselves and influenced solely by rational, cognitive, mental types of considerations, right? But what it does not in any way indicate, as far as I can see, is that conscious choices influenced by such factors are not efficacious. Instead, the lesson is that efficacious choices that do result in behavior, can be influenced in surprising and sometimes hidden ways. Okay. Fourth, these studies come very low tech, come from social psychology. Often unrecognized situational factors seem to influence individual moral choices to a surprising degree in many people. Right? That's a kind of abstract statement of the suggestion. Now let me explain what that means through an example or two. So a variety of subjects indicate that the percentage of people who are willing to help someone in need will vary significantly, or perhaps even dramatically, depending on such factors as how many other people were perceived to be around in a position to help and not helping. Right? So if you're in a situation where someone who really needs help, right, physically hurt in some way, and if there are 10 other people standing around, they don't seem to be doing anything, you're going to be less likely to do anything than if you seem to be the only one who is in a position to help. Okay? That's well known. How busy you are, right? The Good Samaritan. This is an image from the famous parable of the Good Samaritan in the New Testament. This study is just one of my all-time favorite studies. They very clever, devious kind of study. They took seminary students, right? They were taking a course on preaching, right? And they were assigned to preach a sermon for a class on the parable of the Good Samaritan. Right? The parable of the Good Samaritan. Samaritan's lying by the roadside, physically been robbed and beaten, right? Many of the religious leaders, walk by in the parable, and they don't stop to help the person for whatever, why they might have chosen not to do that. But the despised Samaritan, right, despised by the religious Jews of Jesus' day, he stops, he helps the stranger, he goes out of his way, blah, blah. Okay, it's a parable, well-known parable to Christians, And they're asked to preach a sermon on this. And they are, in each case, hindered from getting to the place on time by some ruse, right? Something about their kind of get locked in their building. They think it's just, that there's something going on. Somebody, a phone call that delays them or whatever. So they're rushing out the door, right? Because they're late for their class presentation, right? No student wants to be late for their class presentation. And what do? But they have a person lying down who's hurt. and it's something like, 80% of them just rush right on by so they can preach that sermon on how you should stop to help your neighbor in need. Okay, that's the very, because they're in a hurry, right? That's the thought. Otherwise, reasonably conscientious seminarians want to go on to become pastors, church leaders. All right, that's that. The jackhammer study is, once I describe it to you, you'll realize how dated an example this is. It is, they have a car in your neighborhood that is broken down, someone has the hood up, and so they obviously have car trouble, and they count what percentage of people stop when they drive by. And it's a safe neighborhood, so it's not like people are kind of worried if they get out, that it's often their own neighborhood, close to their own home. And they count how many people stop to help this person, right? And the reason, right away you're thinking this is dated, well, why don't they just call on a cell phone? This is pre-cell phone, right? Or you're thinking, the person, him or herself, can call on her cell phone, right? No, this is pre-cell phone, so you're kind of stuck without this sort of thing. I know some of you might say, what do you mean with a cell phone? You have to go into a physical building, into a house, and your phone, and it's attached to the wall, believe it or not. It's got a cord, so you have to stand next to the wall. That was the situation. My father still has such a phone in his home. So that's the control group is just as I've described. The experimental group is you have either a very loud, annoying noise going on in the background, the jackhammer breaking up cement, or you have a very noxious odor going on in the background. So you hold on a minute. Okay. And it turns out the percentage of people who stop drops under those annoying ambient conditions. And then they flag people down a couple blocks later, and they stop them. I don't know how much they reveal about what was going on, but they say, oh, did you notice that car back there? Yeah, I did, or everything. Oh, did you stop to help? No, I didn't, and everything. Ask them why, and they give explanations. Oh, I needed to, blah, blah, blah. Everything. Oh, did you know that there was this loud jackhammer going on in the background? Is that a reason why? Not everyone's. Oh no, that's irrelevant. I mean, that wouldn't prevent me from stopping or anything. But nevertheless, the percentage of people dropped significantly, suggesting it is an influence on how people behave, but they seemingly sincerely are not aware. Now, the first thing to be said about these studies. And these studies have been popularized in books by Malcolm Gladwell and even by a distinguished social scientist, Daniel Kahneman. They have come under heavy criticism as people have tried but failed to replicate their findings. So like the seminarian study, people have tried to replicate it, they didn't seem to get the results. And there's a lot of discussion, actually, if you go online, replication of social psychology, priming effects, and other types of very striking effects in the social science literature. People are having trouble actually replicating these findings. This is the big discussion. It turns out it's very hard to get funding to do simple replication studies in the sciences. We already know that. We don't need to get funding. So the matter is still debated on these kinds of studies. And there seems to be reasonably broad agreement that these so-called situational effects on moral decision-making, if real, are probably a bit more modest than the very strong divergences that were originally advertised. Supposing these effects are real, they would support the important lesson that we are often not fully aware, again, of the influences on our own motivations. More hopefully, they might point to common forms of situational influence that we can learn about, and if desired, combat through conscious reflection. So I can be armed by this kind of information. Oh, people sometimes even people who want to be reasonably helpful and engage in moral behavior can often be influenced by these kinds of considerations. Knowing about that could make me less susceptible to being influenced by that. I can go through a checklist. Why am I choosing not to help in this situation? But again, they don't seem to provide support for the willusionist thesis that conscious choices, however influenced, are not exercises of real self-control. Okay. The fifth arrow of the willusionist quiver is a set of phenomena known under the general heading of disorders of the will. We may know two examples. So in anarchic or alien hand syndrome, complex movements of a person's hand are carried out in a smooth way toward the execution of an apparent goal. So taking someone's glass of water, say. It's not just some kind of random movement, right? Take that glass of water and go like that. That's clearly a purposive behavior. Yet, the person seemingly sincerely claims not to have intended to do the action. And they're generally unwanted, causing embarrassment. So some of you will recognize Peter Sellers here in Stanley Kubrick's film, Dr. Strangelove. Right? So it's a weird kind of phenomena where the person's engaging in a behavior, but consciously they don't see it as their behavior. It's not something they think of themselves as having wanted to do. Very, very weird, right? Because it's purposive behavior. It's not just like their arm was there was some kind of impulse, nervous impulse that they just simply can't control in the way that people ordinarily can. So it's a purposive behavior. All right, second example, some severely schizophrenic patients report the perception that other agents are controlling their actions, even though there's good reason to believe that the actions must issue from the patient's own intentions, albeit unconscious intentions. Right? They're the only ones around. In both cases, the people involved are acting purposively and under no discernible control by some external agent or source. Yet they lack, in some sense, the feeling of being the authors of their actions, of being in control of what they're doing. All right, with these cases, we're getting still closer to the target of the ostensible target. We're moving from the realms of belief and motivation into that of the experience of choice and action. But observe that these are hardly paradigmatic cases of acting freely, right? Where the agent experiences herself as consciously intending to act in a certain way. There's still not cases of that, right? Instead, they are cases of purposive actions that are not consciously willed. But in having that feature, being a purposive action that is not consciously willed by the agent, these actions are hardly unusual. They are instances of what scientists often call the automaticity that characterizes a great deal of our behavior. For example, our performing habitual acts while our minds are otherwise occupied. That's when I ride my bike into campus every day, the same route that I always do. I'm not thinking, I'm not willing, move to the left, move to the right. I'm doing these things, but I'm not consciously directing the movements. It's purely automated, right? I'm thinking. My head's in the clouds, I'm thinking, and yet somehow I manage not to get into an accident. I'm responsive. When the light turns red, I stop, but I don't think about it, right? There's a responsiveness that's largely unconscious, right? It involves taking in conscious visual and perceptual information, but I'm not consciously controlling what I'm doing. And thank goodness for that. Just think about it. All of us, we'd all be exhausted by noon and go to bed if we had to. Everything we did from the moment we woke, we had to say, okay, now do this. Move your right foot, move your left foot, move your right foot, right, move your left, move it with this much force, right? No, that would be highly inefficient, right? It would be exhausting if we did that. William James, the famous psychologist, philosopher, quipped more than a century ago that the movement of one's feet when one descends quickly down a flight of stairs is a matter best left unconsidered. Right? His point was, if you actually told yourself what to do, you'd be liable to trip, right? Because you don't even know consciously exactly what it is you're doing when you walk down. But if you just do it, all goes well in most cases. Not all the time, but most of the time. It's much better. Alien hand and schizophrenic actions are unusual in striking them, not because they involve automaticity, but because the unconsciously generated action is both at odds with the agent's own standing intentions for how to act, right? At least those the agent consciously identifies with, and is missing, when the action is being carried out, it's missing that background sense that we normally have of being in control, even when we're not specifically willing the action. So again, when I'm back on my bike, even though I'm not consciously telling myself what to do, I have a general sense of being in control, right? I can stop the bike if I need to, and it feels like I'm in control. It's a kind of a diffuse sense of being in charge, even though I'm not. I'm like the CEO, right? And things are getting carried out. Yeah, everything's going fine, so I don't need to intervene. But if something happens I don't like, then I can seize control. I'm kind of generally in control, but not monitoring the details. I'm not micromanaging what's happening, right? But these kinds of people lack that sense of being broadly in control of what they're doing. They're totally surprised by what's happening. It seems to them as if someone's taken over their body. But these kinds of cases do not call into question the veridicality, again, of experiences of conscious willing when these actually occur, because that's not what's going on here, right? So it seems relevant, and maybe there's more to be said about this, because it's clearly relevant to thinking in general scientific terms about the phenomena of conscious will. But again, these are not cases where we have a clear case of an agent consciously willing to do something, and yet we've got independent evidence that, in fact, that experience of conscious willing was not in any way directing or be the source or initiation of the person's behavior. Okay, so fine. Many people find very powerful evidence for willusionism in the neuroscientist Benjamin Libet's pioneering studies that began in 1983 and have since been refined by other people like Patrick Agard, the person that I showed you a photo of a while back. And these do focus on the experience of conscious will itself and specifically on its timing. Okay, so let me tell you about Libet's ingenious experiment. So he devised a simple study in which people are asked to wiggle their finger, right? And to do so within a short interval of time, say within 30 seconds. The reason for the time limit is you're going to get asked to do this about 100 times within the course of an hour, and so they don't want to be waiting around for 2 hours for you to just decide to do it once, right? So they say, look, we want you to choose freely, don't pre-plan, but try to do it within an interval of 30 seconds, but it can be 1 second after go, or it can be 29 seconds, or it can be 15, you decide when. So that's what you're supposed to be in control of, when you move your finger. Throughout, before you make your momentous decision, right, you are to watch a special dial clock-like object that has a beam of light that goes around much faster than a hand on a clock, several times a second actually, right? And you're supposed to pay attention always to where that is, like at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. And at the moment you feel the urge or wish or decision, there's some fuzziness of language that gets used here that I don't like, but at any rate, at the moment you feel like now is when I consciously, this is the moment, right? Be looking at that clock and pay attention, remember where that dial was, so you can then report. It was at 4 o'clock when I first felt the urge to move my finger. All right, while all this is going on, they've got a cap on your head with a lot of electrodes hanging off of it, and they're measuring the electrical activity going on in your brain, right? And Libet discovered that there's a steady increase, an uptick in this activity, and it's an activity that was dubbed by other researchers the readiness potential, or RP, which is what you see, the onset of the readiness potential. And the really surprising thing that Libet found was that the onset of the RP, this steady buildup of electrical activity, consistently preceded the time that the agents cited is when they experienced the will to move. By averaging results over hundreds of experiments, Libet determined that the readiness potential preceded willing experience by an average of somewhere between 250 and 350 milliseconds. Libet and others concluded from this result that conscious will is not the initiator of voluntary action, but is instead a consequence of an unconscious physical process that also triggers the actions. All right, so this really is the thing that gets lots and lots of attention. What should one make of this study? I'm going to note first, there are significant doubts about the reliability of people's subjective timing estimates. Now, of course, if you're a scientist, you're immediately thinking, well, wait a minute, light going from the clock to your eye, well, that happens very rapidly. That takes a little bit of time, right, to get processed through the optic nerve, to the visual cortex. You know, that you got to they account for that, right? Nobody disputes about that. But so even you know, discounting that time interval that would take, people we know independently that you can change people's perception of the timing of when some conscious experience happened quite a bit by priming them with various kinds of events either before or after the conscious episode in question. A really good discussion of these issues is Faraday paper number 17 by Peter Clark. Put out, I don't know if you know, that Faraday puts out these nice little things. You can see he's a scientist, very succinct, much more so than I am. The Libet experiment and its implications for conscious will. So I recommend this. It's a really clear and succinct summary of issues, worries about, methodological worries about these kinds of experiments. But I'm going to set that aside. I'm going to stipulate for my purposes there aren't any real problems with that sort. And so we're going to suppose that it really is true that there is a buildup of electrical activity that is associated with conscious decision making that precedes in this experimental setup by a short interval of time. It precedes the person's becoming aware of any conscious urge or wish or decision to move. Instead, I'm going to invite us to ask the question, how representative are these choices? Right? Are these good prototypes for what we would think of as spontaneous free choices? Should we treat them as similar in all respects, relevant respects, to the free moral choices that people make out in the wild, right? To use a bit of lingo, you know, do these kinds of studies have much ecological validity? That's a term that some scientists like. Well, consider that, one, these actions are trivial actions. You keep people doing them they don't care about. And the action itself is already decided on. By agreeing to participate in the experiment, you've already decided what you're going to do. You're going to flick your wrist or your finger or whatever. And the question is only of when you're going to do it and within a short interval of time. Second, they are performed repeatedly. Dozens of trials over an hour for our college student to earn her 10-pound beer money, right? You got to do this again and again and again if you want to get your 10 pounds, right? Predictably, the timing begins to fall into patterns, right? So some people tend to do it very quickly, others late, you know, others kind of a variation, and they find, yes, that a few people tend to do it along the pattern of those students who fill out student-teacher course evaluations, where this is what the response looks like. If you've ever been a teacher, you know this. It goes like this. The answers to questions, you know, where you know you get the on the left, that's great rating, outstanding instructor. You know, over here is terrible, etc. And you get these students who obviously they don't care, and they just choose this sort of thing. So while it's supposed to be spontaneous, right? People are showing patterns, and it's not surprising to us that that would be the case, right? It's a very boring kind of experiment to participate in. And the third, even I think most crucial factor, is that you are required, in order for them to do this experiment, you have to pinpoint a moment, very precise moment of onset, introspectively, of a conscious decision or impulse or urge or something. And to do that, you have to adopt a passive observer stance in relation to yourself. You have to catch yourself in the act of deciding, right? Interestingly, I found out in talking to Patrick Bigard, a minority, but non-negligible minority, somewhere as many as perhaps 30% of people, when they're given the instructions, they say, I can't do that. They find it contradictory. I'm supposed to decide freely, spontaneously, but I'm supposed to, sort of at the very same time, watch myself doing it, and pinpoint the time. Most people think they can do it, and they do it, and they participate, right? But a certain percentage of people find it really difficult. And I think that's unsurprising, because this is not, right, when we're making moral choices, when we're making any kind of choices out in the world, we're not at the very same time trying to watch ourselves saying, when am I doing it, right? That's to observe yourself, right? So it seems to me that if you take all these factors together, it's really plausible this is not a prototype of a free, spontaneous choice. Instead, something like the following interpretation suggests itself. By agreeing to participate in the study, to get your beer money, these are always with college students. If you didn't know that, college students perform the bulk of studies of this sort. You have thereby formed an intention already to act upon some kind of internal cue, right? Some kind of conscious experiential cue. This initiates an unconscious process that promotes the occurrence or perhaps evolution, right, of a conscious state of desire or intention that is not something you actively form, right? It just wells up. In context, the state's default is to trigger the pre-planned activity, at least absent any last-second veto. And here, very interestingly, Libet considered that possibility. He did another study where he asked people, all right, just as before, I want you to decide spontaneously when to move your finger. I want you to note the time you do that, and then I want you to not move your finger. Got it? Decide to move your finger. And it's not a decision, I will move my finger later. No, it's decide to move your finger right now, and then don't do it. Veto it, cut it off, kill it. Hit the kill switch. Cut off whatever's going on internally. Going from that conscious impulse, and people can do this. A higher percentage of people balk at this thing. They say, I can't do this. What are you asking me to do? This is crazy. I don't know how to do this, right? Even more people. But those who said, yeah, okay, I think I get it, it turned out they can do this. It's possible to veto a decision that is the time between the actual beginning of the movement, where you're past the point of no return in terms of the movement of the finger. There's enough time interval between that and this experience of conscious willing that you can veto it. And so this led Libet to say, we have no control over what our conscious choices are, but we are capable of vetoing. Your brain decides what you're going to do, and then you have the ability to either veto what your brain decides or not. So people say, Libet does not believe in free will, but he believes in free want. In all the respects then that I've just noted, these choices, if we call them that, are unlike ordinary decision making, especially ones that have a strong interpersonal and moral element. Should I lie to my friend to save myself some kind of personal embarrassment? How do I respond to a hostile social situation where someone else is getting belittled, when I know that if I intervene, I myself may become an object of ridicule, right? There's a lot of creativity in thinking about how to respond to something like that. Suppose I decide I should do something, right? One way to do something is to be very confrontational. Another way is to try to tell a joke, to kind of diffuse, deflect attention away, right? Actual choices are complex, right, in ways that these are not. These are not complicated, and I'm not observing myself, right? And I've not pre-planned anything in detail about what I'm going to do. I do have dispositions. Certain personality types are far more likely to respond to that situation in one way rather than the other. But even relative to a given personality type, there's a range of possibilities that I'm aware of, right? In short, so even if we waive worries that some have about the reliability of subjective reports of precise timing of conscious events, it's highly plausible that the subject's actions in these experimental setups are not prototypical spontaneous conscious willings. And so they don't have clear negative implications for human freedom of action. All right. Having finished, how much time do I have? Oh, okay. Let me go very quickly. I expect an objection, right? So I kind of reviewed this, and I'm throwing a lot of cold water on some of these steps. And I expect an objection. In fact, I expect. Dan Wegner raised this objection years ago when I gave a talk at a conference with some neuroscientists and a few philosophers where I was debunking him. Here's Dan's objection, basically. All of your negative arguments may be correct. Yeah, none of these studies show that we don't have free will, blah, blah, blah. Yet, you have provided us with no positive reason to think that we are free and responsible. Where's your evidence for that? That's a huge empirical assumption. That we all assume this in practice, sure, we do that, but that's worthless as evidence. That's not evidence. It's a mere prejudice. It's no more evidential weight that we should give to that than to folk physics. Rodney doesn't consult ordinary people when trying to decide what he should think about astrophysics. We shouldn't consult ordinary people when we're trying to really understand scientifically what's going on when human beings engage in supposedly conscious decision making. This sort of attitude, I think, is very common among the willusionists. I think it rests on a naive conception of the underpinnings of scientific evidence and of human rationality generally. Despite Descartes, famously the 17th century philosopher, his heroic efforts to doubt all his beliefs and rebuild from scratch, notwithstanding those heroic lessons. The one thing philosophers agree on, people have said, well, philosophers don't agree about it, anything. Sure, we agree on a lot of negative things. Various projects have failed. And one thing we all agree on is Descartes' heroic project of trying to say, I'm going to doubt everything, and then I find, oh, I think, therefore I am, right? There's one thing I can't, reasonably doubt, and I'm going to rebuild from there and be able to reconstruct the basis for science and everything else, and theology beside. That's hopeless. I think, therefore I am isn't going to support all that. You can't do it, right? We have to start somewhere. And specifically, if we are to avoid total skepticism about our knowledge in general, something that no one in practice can sustain, we must assume, one, the rough reliability of our basic belief-forming capacities, and two, the truth of our most foundational beliefs about reality. What do I mean by this? Well, our basic capacities for forming beliefs about the world include our senses, our memory, basic forms of deductive and inductive reasoning. All of these are demonstrably fallible. Human beings are not perfect reasoners by a long shot, and of course we know our senses sometimes deceive us. But we learn the limits of these capacities, and we learn how to use them more critically. There's no way of getting outside of the framework of having these capacities and somehow seeing, do they really correspond? No, our only access to reality is through using them. We can't provide independent proof of their reliability. And try to be more careful in the use of them. Our basic beliefs include the belief that the world has a causal law-like structure. That's a kind of an assumption that scientists bring to the world. That it will that structure, that law-like structure, from past experiences, right? We assume the future is going to be like the past in relevant fundamental respects. That parts of the material, you can't argue for that, right? But we just assume it. That human feeling, thinking, and purposive minds, right? That you all aren't a bunch of automata, right? And I'm the only conscious, real You can't argue for that. What are you going to do? You say, well, look, I know that when speech comes out of my mouth, it's animated by conscious thoughts and so on. All right, I see intelligent seeming speech coming out of Rodney's mouth, so probably, by analogy, there's a conscious mind there. Generalizing from a single instance, that doesn't sound like a very plausible, kind of argument, or any kind of, let alone to generalize to 7 billion people from one single instance. No, we can't really construct an argument for that, but we assume it, and we're entitled to assume it. And our fundamental belief that informs all of our social and moral practice, notwithstanding all the cultural and religious variations among human practices. So a belief underlying human social moral practice generally, that our experience of having some measure of control and being responsible for how we act is veridical. None of these beliefs can be established by non-circular arguments, but that they are not reasonable is scarcely credible. Unlike most other things we believe, they do not need to be inferred from evidence in order to be reasonable. These beliefs, you might say, are properly basic. You have to have starting points, right? And we take these, the most fundamental beliefs that we have, that underlie all of our practices and our more specific beliefs about the world, to be properly basic, that is, reasonably believed in the absence of any independent evidence for them. So in short, I would contend that our belief that we are free and morally responsible too is properly basic. Innocent until proven guilty. Not to say that there couldn't be a case against it, but we're entitled to it, right, until we have powerful evidence to think otherwise. I was going to say, one final thought. I'll just note that scientific practice, it seems, to be intelligible, has to assume that scientists know in a rough and ready way what they're doing and why. Because science is a massively social enterprise, right? Scientists listen to the results reported by other scientists, right? It's a hugely communally distributed enterprise. Why do I take seriously things that, if I'm a scientist, that I read in journals about reports, right? It's because I believe that the authors of those studies, most of them, yes, there's fraud, but by and large, most of them, they really did set out to do what they said they did. They really did observe the result, and that's why they wrote down what they did, not for some completely independent reason that they know nothing about, right? And the referees at those journals, right, were similarly knew why they said, yes, this should be published, and yada, 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 right? If none of that were true, if nobody knew what they're doing or why, we'd have no reason for being confident at all in the results. So we'd undermine, right, the whole scientific enterprise to assume that in general, human beings don't know what they're about and why. That's what's going on there. Since I'm out of time, I'll just quickly flash through. So am I saying that science has nothing to teach us about freedom and moral responsibility? Well, freedom is linked to our awareness and our own motivations. It's linked to whether nature plus nurture makes certain choice patterns by an individual virtually inevitable or not, right? This is much debated. Both of these factors come in degrees, and they can vary over time and across kinds of choices. And the implications of that, I think, are that human freedom is always a limited thing. It comes in degrees. It's fragile. And the empirical sciences potentially then will have a lot to teach us about the precise extent and scope of human freedom. Maybe it has more sharply limited scope than we would pre-reflectively have thought. Right? Once we recognize that we don't have to think about it as an all or nothing matter, right? Maybe we will learn some things, some surprising things from future science about the scope of our freedom and responsibility. But we need evidence for that, and the kind of evidence that we've been given certainly, I think, do not warrant the sweeping claim that we see. So, that'd be out. Thanks.